Together. So I'm here and you're here to learn together. As most of you know, I was on a 3-month sabbatical this past summer. I requested it, it was granted, and it was great. And I encourage everyone to give it a try someday, if your job allows you to do that, because it was a really nice time for me and the family to take a deep breath, and then also to do some studying. And so what I'll be sharing tonight is what I learned while on sabbatical, at least part of it. What I decided to study was quite large in scope, and probably too large, and if I were to do it again, I would probably choose some aspect and then dive deeper. But sometimes you need to start with the big picture to get a lay of the land before you figure out where you really want to go. And I wanted to learn more about the religious landscape in Canada. I wanted to get a feel for how things have changed over the years and try to get an understanding of where things are going. And ordinarily, I'm not drawn to sociology. I mean, I am drawn to trying to understand people, but sociology books are often filled with charts and graphs and all kinds of technical data, which usually I just gloss over and say, oh, you know, give me the interpretation, tell me what it means, but charts and graphs, they are not my thing. But my curiosity in this area has been growing, and I thought maybe during my sabbatical it would be good to look into this. It started a few years ago, and I was talking to a church planner in town, and he gave me a statistic, and it was this statistic, 5%. And he said, David, do you know that just under 5% of people in Victoria are worshiping in church on a given Sunday morning? He's like, less than, he said 4. I was like, I don't believe that. I'm going up to 5. And I think it actually probably is higher after doing my research. But he said 5%, and that included the non-evangelical crowd too. So those who are Roman Catholic, United Church of Canada, Anglican, and the more mainline denominations as well. So that stat really hit me hard, and it impacted me in a few ways. The first way it impacted me is that I knew that if that stat was true, that I could no longer lob careless critiques at other Christian traditions in my teaching and preaching. So Reformed Christians have this nasty little habit of defining ourselves in relation to Catholics on the one side and Anabaptist folks on the other side. So if you look at the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism, for instance, we're always trying to define ourselves in relation to these other Christian traditions, which of course makes a whole lot of sense when your world is filled with Christians, some of whom happen to be Catholic and some of whom happen to be Anabaptist. So when everyone's a Christian, it makes sense to define yourself in relation to other Christians. But if only 5% of the city is going to church on a Sunday morning, then defining yourself in relation to the 5% seems quite ridiculous. So the absurdity of that just struck me. So I repented, not that I lobbed careless critiques at Christians too much, but I did do it a few times, and I repented of that, and I thought that is not something I'm going to do again unless it's super, super, super important. We just cannot be critiquing each other when we are such a minority. The second impact that that statistic had on me is that I began to think of myself as a missionary. Welcome, Amber. You can grab a seat somewhere. I began to think of myself as a missionary. So my childhood church, and maybe yours, used to send missionaries to places elsewhere in the world. So missions work was done somewhere else by someone else, right? Not so much a local thing, but an international thing. So we'd send missionaries to Africa and to China because people over there hadn't heard the message about Jesus yet. So that's why we were sending missionaries. Now, I didn't think when God called me to Victoria that God was calling me to a mission field. But what that statistic told me is that, well, that's exactly the case. I mean, what do you call someone who's moving to a place where about 95% of the inhabitants are taking a pass on church on a Sunday morning? So over the last few years, I've been trying to own my missionary identity and just give it to myself. David, you are a missionary. And what do missionaries do? Well, first of all, you have to learn the language of the people, right? You have to learn the value systems of the culture. And you also have to read boring sociology books, right? In order to get a feel for where you are. So that's the backdrop to why I chose to study this. Now, before I put some boring charts and statistics up on the screen, I just want to start with a few stories. My hope is that we get a feel. Numbers tell one story, but I want to tell personal stories just to help us get a feel for where we are. So in July, my family went to Harrison Hot Springs, which is on the mainland. Friends from ours from Ontario were there for the summer. And one morning we went for a walk on a local trail called the Spirit Trail. The Spirit Trail is a 2-kilometer loop through a lush tract of forest. So there's Douglas firs, cedars, all the nice things we like about the forests around here. This trail is called the Spirit Trail because one day in 2007, a local artist had a chance encounter with another hiker. The other hiker said that the woods felt haunted, and to him it felt as though all the trees had their own unique personality. So the artist went back to his studio and he began to make faces out of clay. Then on his walk through the woods, he'd match faces to trees based on how he saw that tree's personality. So all through the Spirit Trail, you see faces hanging from the trees, like this. Is one example. Sorry, the pictures, the quality's not great, but you get a sense for it. So there's probably about, 150 faces. Like literally all these trees have their own faces, and of course it's a lot of fun to just walk around and look at them. And then at the end, I noticed that there's a trailhead, explaining the forest, and this is what I read. These masks enhance the trail's already present spiritual feel. Look for a circle of trees with masks to find the ideal spot for quiet contemplation. So there's this one spot in the midst of the trail where there's faces all around, and there's a couple seats so you could sit there. Perfect spot for quiet contemplation. There aren't any churches in Harrison Hot Springs, but there's a Spirit Trail. And for more and more British Columbians, that's all they need to curb their appetite for the spiritual. A few days after this trip, I was listening to the CBC, which I often do while driving. The radio host was interviewing Amos Clifford. Amos Clifford is a man who wrote a book called about forest therapy, or also known as forest bathing. Forest bathing began in Japan, and it's migrated over to the west coast of Canada. So Amos Clifford leads bathing hikes through Stanley Park, and he wrote this book. And he believes that the seeds of the forest bathing movement were planted by the forest itself. This is what he wrote. Somehow the earth is dreaming this work into being, spreading it like the seeds of a dandelion. Many of these seeds are taking root. What is its purpose in calling us back into the forests? Clifford's answer to that question is that the forest is calling us into a reciprocal relationship of mutual awakening. He believes that the forest is inviting us in to come and be renewed. Another story. Earlier in the summer, I was talking to a fellow parent at our neighborhood park. We spend a lot of time there. It's a great place to hear stories. She asked me what I do, and I told her that I was a pastor. She told me that she grew up Anglican, that her family went to an Anglican church in Ontario, but that once the priest moved away to another church, their family left the church, and she hasn't really been since she was about 13. Her husband has never been to church in his entire life, ever, and doesn't really see the need for it. She doesn't really have a desire to be part of a religious community either, but now she has a 2-year-old son, and she'd like to expose that son to something. She's just not really sure what or how to go about doing it. I asked her what she does for work, and she practices acupuncture. Acupuncture, of course, grew out of traditional Chinese medicine, and so by putting tiny little needles into pores, acupuncturists try to restore balance to the body. I don't know much about it, but it's an alternative health practice here in BC. Another park story. Also during the summer, I had another conversation with another woman, and she makes sure every year that she sends her 2 children to vacation Bible school. She grew up going to Sunday school herself, but her family stopped going to church at a certain point in her life. She wants her kids to be exposed to religion, however, just like she was, but she really wants them to make up their own minds about it. So she wants to expose them to it, but not hoist religion upon them. And through my research, this attitude is oh so Canadian, okay? We value individual choice, freedom of expression. These values are currently very fundamental to what it means to be a Canadian. And that extends even to parent-child, right? Don't hoist values onto your children, or at least not religion specifically. That's a no-no. But my park acquaintance, she wants to expose her children to religion, but she is really worried about the future. She believes that her religious upbringing gave her a strong moral foundation, and she worries what will happen to the future because she doesn't know anyone else, no other parents. She doesn't know anyone else who is bringing their kids to church. We are her only acquaintances that bring our children to be educated by the church. So she's worried about that. She doesn't know what the future holds. One more story, or 2 more, I guess. This past year, I've been making a concerted effort to get to know other dads at this dads group at the neighborhood place at Perks Arena. It's become a highlight of my week, and I've even restructured my week just so that I can go. It also gives Brittany some time at home to do other things which she really likes. And I'm just having the most awesome conversations with all these people, and it's really quite fascinating. But I met one man there. He's from Miami. He's a Cuban-born, immigrated to Miami, immigrated somehow way out here. He grew up a Christian, but he was reading Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and then he read the story of the Tower of Babel, and he's like, it's all the same. Like the Bible is just like that. And so for him, that was kind of starting to lead him on a different trajectory. So even though this dad, he currently practices no religion, but he is obsessed with self-help podcasts. So he listens to these old Navy Marine, like who are retired, who are just like, do this, get your life in order. He's also a disciple of Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you know him, but his big mission in life is to help people sort out their lives. So he's working to sort out his life, but he's having trouble with it. And he's feeling kind of ashamed that he's not making it further, like he's not sorting out his life. So he experiences the weight of that. And I just really like being around him. He asks me all kinds of questions about me, about my life, about my ministry, and I'm just sharing honestly about what I think about all these things. And then finally, this is the last story. I did most of my research for this on this topic at Starbucks at Gatewood Village, right by my house. They have free refills if you have a Starbucks card. That's a big plus for me. And the summer Starbucks playlist included a song by the Fleet Foxes called Helplessness Blues. And of course they have a rotation, so I pretty much heard it every time I went in there. And I really love the song, so I thought I'd play it for you now. And I also think it helps us get a feel for where we are. It's just so fascinating. So the Fleet Foxes are a band from Seattle, which of course is very much shares a similar culture to us here in Victoria. And I'll play half the song.
I was raised up believing I was somehow unique, like a snowflake, distinct among snowflakes, unique in each way you can see. And now after some thinking, I'd say I'd rather be a functioning cog in some great machinery, serving something beyond me. But I don't know what that will be. I'll get back to you someday soon. You will see. What's my name? What's my station? Oh, just tell me what I should do. I don't need to be kind to the armies of night that will do such injustice to you. Or bow down and be grateful and say, sure, take all that you see. To the men who move on me in dimly lit halls and determine my future for me. And I don't know who to believe. I'll get back to you someday soon. You will see. If I know only one thing, it's that everything that I see of the world outside is so inconceivable. Often I barely can speak. Yeah, I'm tongue-tied and dizzy, and I can't keep it to myself. What good is it to sing helplessness blues? Why should I wait for anyone else? And I know you will keep me on the shelf. I'll come back to you someday soon.
So, I don't quite know everything the author is trying to communicate with that song, but it strikes me that he's confused, right? There's some confusion. He's raised up believing that he's unique, right? He's raised in Seattle, a place where there's been very little religious education or formation, and parents are helping their children, oh, you precious little snowflake, you know, you are so unique and individual, and you could be anything you want to be, and the world is yours, go and do something interesting. And now he's like, now I'm thinking I'd rather be a functioning cog in some great machine, something, serving something beyond me, right? So he's raised up wanting, the individualistic pathway is out in front of him. You can be whoever you want to be, but now he's seeing that that is not what he wants, and he'd rather serve something, be part of something bigger than himself. But he doesn't want to give it away yet, right? He doesn't want people to tell him who he is. So he's not quite ready to be a cog, because a cog just does what it's supposed to do, right? He kind of wants to choose. So he's holding on to that individualistic ideal, but also wanting to be part of something bigger. And then the whole nature piece, you know, if I know only one thing, it's that everything that I see is so inconceivable. Often I can barely speak. So there's just this, you see some of these, I think a lot of themes actually in that song are very, they capture the spiritual climate of what it looks like, you know, the spiritual climate of certainly our West Coast. And I hope all these stories are helping you get a feel for where we are, you know? This is, we live in interesting times, spiritually speaking. One of the people that has been most helpful for understanding the the times, unfortunately, it's so inaccessible in some ways. I had to read the book like 3 times, and I still don't think I understand it completely. It's Jamie Smith is writing about Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor is a Catholic philosopher from McGill. He wrote a 1,000-page book called A Secular Age, and Jamie Smith tried to condense that into about 140 pages, and it's marvelous, but it's really hard to understand. But what Charles Taylor does very well is he describes the confusion that singer is singing about. Just the cross-pressured experience of our current moment. And this is the pressure that Charles Taylor tries. I'm going to try to describe it, and we'll see if I succeed. But on the one hand, we are pressed in by this force called, Taylor calls immanentization. Let me see if I got my quote up there. So immanentization is the process whereby meaning, significance, and fullness are sought within an enclosed, self-sufficient, naturalistic universe without any reference to transcendence. So just think of like a big dinner plate, and we put that over the plate, and that's an enclosed world. So that's, Taylor also calls that the immanent frame. And so we have this pressure, like this is the way we interpret the world. This is the way, and we're not even thinking our way through it. This is just kind of what's given to us. And I have an example, or it's a pressure pushing in against this. I have an example maybe that will help. But the same friend who we met in Harrison Hot Springs, he went to Israel on a trip the year before, and he was around the Sea of Galilee, and he was looking out over the sea, and he was struck. He's like, this is where Jesus walked on the water. And the first thought that came into my mind was, did that really happen? So that's the pressure, because I'm in this current moment. It's hard for me to just accept that, right? There's this pressure saying stuff like that doesn't happen in an enclosed universe that is not open to mystery and, miracles. So we have that, and we all, in some ways, experience that to some degree. Like, for instance, when you're looking at the weather, you don't say, God caused it to rain today. You say, no, processes in nature have aligned in such a way that it has rained, right? Whereas the ancient folks, they believed that the world didn't have this big dinner plate over top of it, and so they had an understanding of the world that was much more porous, and that God was actively involved with all these daily events. So you feel that one pressure on the one side, but then on the other side, we are still haunted by this feeling of transcendence, and there's a pressured situation we find ourselves in. It turns out that it's hard to get comfortable in an enclosed universe. I mean, it feels liberating in some sense to not be under the authority of God or some being, but eventually the thrill wears off, and you start to have this nagging feeling that there is more going on in the world than meets the eye. So you go to a concert, for instance, and you almost have a spiritual experience, right? It's just sound waves going through the air. It's really nothing, but you feel like there's more. You feel like there's a fullness. You feel uplifted in your spirit somehow. Or you go for a walk in the woods, and it's just wood and light and fresh air, but then you get this feeling that that one of the trees is looking at you, and it has its own distinct personality, and that it needs a face, and that the woods is haunted. And here's a face that's winking. All of a sudden you're like, the trees, they're alive, right? The world has this haunted feeling. And so that's the pressure that Taylor is trying to describe that I think is captured in that song. I don't know if I explained that totally well, but I think what's key here is that this isn't something we're thinking our way through, but just something we experience in life. It's our feel of the present. And Taylor, just how he describes it, it's like, oh, that is how I feel. That is how I experience life in the world. So believers have their doubts, but people who don't believe sometimes doubt their disbelief. They're open to the possibility, well, maybe there is something out there. So that confusion characterizes our current moment. And I think I'm going to come back to that because I think it's helpful for how we might think about moving ahead together as a Christian community, but I'll say more about that later. Now I'll move to some statistics that tell, the story. I guess one more story. One more story. So my grandma is a longtime member of the United Church of Canada. She's actually part of a community that predates Confederation. So this church is people were worshiping in it before Canada was a country. And growing up, my grandma always told me that Canada was a Christian country. I don't know if any of you were ever told that. But before 1970, that actually was a fairly accurate picture of Canadian society. Prior to the 60s, nearly all of Quebec was Catholic and nearly all of Ontario was Protestant. And people didn't really live anywhere else at that time. Actually, just joking. But, that was sort of where the population was centered, at least at that time. And at our centennial celebration in 1967, for those who were there, and you can watch video of this sometimes online, it felt almost like a church service, right? Hymns were sung, prayers were prayed, a priest, a pastor, and a rabbi all participated in the event. So this was in 1967. And this is some statistics. So you can see on the far right, 1961. In 1961, 47% of the country identified as Roman Catholic, 49% identified as Protestant, 1% Eastern Orthodox, 2% other faith, and then I think, does that mean like greater than one? Less than one? Okay. Identified with no religion. I'm not up on my math symbols. So that was, now that's identification. So a lot of people identify as a Catholic and maybe don't practice. But even at that time, practice was quite high. Pretty much over 60% of the country was worshiping fairly regularly in a religious community. So that is basically a Christian country, right? Now, we'll back up. But things changed during the 60s. As Canada was celebrating its centennial birthday, Canadians were quietly exiting through the narthex. Membership in the Anglican Church of Canada peaked in 1964, and it's been in steady decline ever since. Membership in the United Church of Canada peaked in 1965, and it's been in decline ever since. And in Quebec, I like how one journalist put it. He said that church attendance vaporized, literally in 1 year. It was around 1967. So prior to that, about 90% of Quebecers used to participate actively in the Catholic Church. Huge. But that number dropped to 40% in about a year. Imagine that. Imagine if you were a priest. Just like, where'd everyone go? Right? It was the most Canadian of revolutions. A silent one. People just politely stopped coming to church. In 2011, many Canadians still self-identified as Christian. So in 2011, I think this is still quite high. 60% of Canadians checked the Christian box on the census form. So it's clear that we haven't totally lost this Christian identity in our country. 67% is quite high. But weekly worship and active affiliation with particular religious community has been on the decline since the 60s. And here's that graph. So you can see in 1945, about 60%, this is active weekly service attendance in Canada, and it's gone down to about 25% in 2000. What happened? This is it doesn't look that drastic, but it's a fairly significant shift from the majority to 25%. What happened? There's a couple sociologists who have studied this. One of them is the person who's been at it the longest is a guy named Reginald Bibby. He's out of Lethbridge, I believe. And he lays out the key ingredients, and I think he's mostly right. Demographically, what led to the decline of religious participation in Canada was fairly straightforward. The Great Religious Recession took place largely because mainline Protestant groups, so that's United, Anglican, Methodist, Lutheran, I think that's it. Mainline Protestant groups no longer had the luxury of gushing immigration pipelines. To make matters worse, their birth rates were down, and their policies and strategies for retaining their children's religious participation were not always well developed and well executed. Their third and last numerical lifeline, recruiting outsiders, was not really a viable solution given the low priority that many assigned to evangelism. So no more babies, or less. No more immigrants. Some relaxed faith formation practices, and a take-it-or-leave-it approach to evangelism. I think Bibby's conclusions are a little simplistic. It puts all the weight on, or most of the weight on the church, actually, and not taking into account what was happening in society. But I think he lays out some of the key ingredients, and certainly the ones that the church could have been responsible for and should have engaged more diligently. So that's up to 2000. Where are we today? Well, there are different ways to categorize the Canadian religious landscape. Well, here's one way. When Canadians are asked whether they embrace religion, reject religion, or are somewhere in the middle, this is how they respond. So about 30% of Canadians say that they embrace religion. About 26% of Canadians say that they reject it. And then about 40% of Canadians are somewhere in the middle. They neither embrace nor reject. They're not sure. They're confused. They've got these cross pressures, right? It's silly to believe, but yet I'm not sure if I'm ready to let go of this. A few things to note about these statistics. I think it's helpful for just getting the lay of the land. The population of those who embrace religion and those who actively attend church has actually, and I think this is a good sign, has actually not declined that much since the 2000. We've really leveled off in the last 20 years. For about 3 decades, religious communities were bleeding pretty hard, but that has stabilized somewhat over the last 20 years. Bibby believes that this is largely the result of immigration, since new immigrants and their children are way more likely to participate in religious communities. Now we're getting beyond just Christian here, right? So we're talking about all kinds of religious communities. So about 23% of the population is actively practicing in a religious community, so that membership or participating in worship, things like that. But meanwhile, what's also of note here is that the population of those who reject religion has been growing too. Remember what it was back in 1961? Less than 1. Now we've got 23% reject there. The fastest growing religious group in Canada is the religious nuns. And I'm not talking about Catholic nuns here, but people who claim to have no specified religion. So when you get the census form, you get all your religions, and the last one it says none of the above, right? No specific religious identity. And people who check that box, it's growing the fastest. So in 1970, only about 4% of the population checked that box, and in 2011, about 23% of Canadians checked the box. And if you're curious more about the nuns, which I certainly am, here's a breakdown of how it looks on the Canadian landscape. You'll notice right away, way above the national average, right? 44% British Columbia. And way less in the Atlantic provinces. In Quebec, they're confused over there. They're not quite sure. They're not rejecting, but they're not attending. Spiritual, but not religious, maybe. But in BC, it's quite high, and in Victoria, that number is even higher. So it's about 51% in Victoria, which is about the highest in Canada. And of those people who checked no religion, the biggest portion of them are 18 to 35. So you see some trend happening there too. It's more often it's younger people who don't quite know where they belong, or have chosen not to belong anywhere. Okay. And for those further curious about BC and some of our numbers, which I am, here's a nice little graph that is sort of helpful. So 44% no religious affiliation, which we saw on the last slide, and then 14% non-Christian religious identification, and 42% Christian identification. So once again, still quite high. People who'd say, oh yeah, I'm Christian, or I'm Catholic, or I belong to this church. 42% is quite high. Now it's identification. This isn't practice, right? This is just what you say about yourself. So even though 42% of British Columbians identify as Christian, only about 13% of them participate in religious services on a weekly basis, and an additional 4% participate on a monthly basis. So roughly 17% of the population of British Columbia attends church once a month. So higher than 5%, right? The number I've got at the beginning. But that's the whole province. I wonder what it is in Victoria. It's probably less than 17. So things have changed quite a bit in Canada since 1961. Canada used to be majority Christian. Now we still retain the Christian identity in title, but it's not as strong in practice, although there has been a leveling off of that since the 2000s, especially with the new immigrants coming who are generally more religious. But there's still a lot of people in the middle. And I think this is the curious 44% to think hard about. So Reginald Bibby, a Christian sociologist, believes that this large middle group should be of particular interest to the church. Based on his quantitative research, he thinks that there is still a good amount of hunger for the goods that religious communities provide. So essentially for him, the statistics are pretty clear. Canadians are still searching, and they're looking for answers that religion can provide. They want meaning. They want community. They want answers about death and the afterlife. This is clear from the statistics that these things are still high values for most Canadians. And Bibby's belief is that the church has not risen to meet this spiritual hunger of Canadians with an adequate supply of goods. So think of it a little bit in economic terms like supply and demand. He thinks that the demand is there for religious services, but the supply is lacking. So churches are not doing a very good job of meeting people where they are and providing a compelling service. So Bibby is encouraging churches to get with it. So go for it. He's a Christian. He thinks, the hunger is out there. What are you doing to try to engage the hunger? But then there's another sociologist who Bibby taught. So there's a little intramural debate going on here. Joel Thiessen is my age. He's a sociologist at Ambrose University, and I'm going to read whatever he produces over the next little while because I find it just really insightful. So Bibby believes that the hunger for religion in Canada is strong. He believes that if the church builds it, they will come, right? But Joel Thiessen, through his interviews and qualitative research, suggests that this is not the case. So Bibby's good at quantitative, doing the statistical stuff. Joel's good at interviews and getting the qualitative. It may be true, says Thiessen, that Canadians still desire the things that religion provides, but most aren't hungry enough to do anything about that hunger, And of those who hunger, only a few will try to satisfy that hunger by participating in a religious community. So he believes that if the church builds it, they still probably won't come. So it's a little bit of a, optimistic, pessimistic view, depending on how to engage the 44% of Canadians who neither embrace nor, neither embrace nor reject religion. Yeah, something like that. And why this is important, I think, is, we're going to get into what churches can do. And obviously, you can't just be like, well, the culture doesn't want this, so let's not even try. That's not a very helpful approach to ministry. And yet we need to be realistic. And so Joel says in his research, the hunger is not as strong. And he thinks that we're on a pretty, Canada is on a secularization trend. So Thiessen believes that it used to be the case that the culture was tilted towards the front door of the church. People had an easy road into the church. And he says that's been switched. So it's tilted away from the church, and now it's way less likely that people will come. So in his interviews, and this is what I found most helpful about Thiessen, he just shares story after story after story, and you really hear the values of Canadians starting to come out. And what we value is tolerance, inclusion, freedom of expression, and the cardinal sin in Canada is being too pushy with what you believe. Even atheists don't push their belief. I don't believe in God, but I'm not going to push that on you. We're very hesitant to hoist anything that smells like what happens in the United States, where they're a little bit too boisterous. We are like, no. We do not want that around here. So he sees this. Even of those who attend church, there's interviews. He's like, I don't really, I take some things and I leave some things. I agree with some things and I don't. There's just a lack of trust and authority in the church. People are picking and choosing, making their own beliefs. So, pretty interesting. So this is one of his main conclusions. Simply put, individualism, respect, and tolerance, not religion, are the common social bonds that bind the majority of Canadians, and this orientation infuses how many in my study, and I suspect beyond, approach religion. So it's less something to belong to, and more something to kind of tiptoe into, take a few things, learn from it, but you're open to other things as well. That's kind of the approach that Thiessen sees happening. Okay. And then, even though Reginald Bibby is quite optimistic about what the church can do, he still thinks that things have changed drastically and that we are a far cry from where we once were. And he's quite creative with his language here. Viewing religion across Canada these days is like viewing devastation after some tragedy has hit. It's as if a fire of secularization has devastated much of what, through the early 60s, was a flourishing religious forest. Here's a picture of my grandmother's church, Cambridge, Ontario. It's not the original building, but this building's quite old. And last October, they had their last worship service, and they closed the church down. The remaining members amalgamated with another United Church. And my grandma she's in a home now, and so she attends the Mennonite church that's right beside where she lives. But yeah, that's the end of about 170 years of worship, right? Amazing in some ways, but also sad. But keep this church in mind. I've got a good story to tell about that in just a second. So things aren't looking good, but there are a few bright spots, and I'll just spend a moment talking about those. So Catholicism outside of Quebec has actually been doing quite well, interestingly enough. In Toronto, for instance, there are 225 Catholic churches, and they celebrate Mass each week in about 40 different ethnic languages. So the Catholic Church has always done an excellent job with global missions. They haven't just focused on one area. It is everywhere you go in the world, there is expressions of the Catholic Church. And it's big in places like the Philippines, for instance. And now we're getting immigrants from those places where they have done missions work for years and years and years. Those people are now coming to Canada, and they're joining up with Catholic churches in Toronto, for instance. So very interesting trends happening there. Also, the evangelical crowd. So the mainline churches are probably United Church of Canada, Anglican Church, Lutheran, Methodist. But the Anglican crowds, all the Pentecostals, Baptists, we kind of fit in there too. We're a little bit mainline, but probably more evangelical. We've been holding steady. So evangelicals make up about 10% of the Canadian population, and it's been that way for about 100 years. So 10%, we are holding steady for 100 years. Bibby thinks this is largely due to immigration as well. But it's also, people are leaving the mainline traditions and moving over to the evangelical traditions as well. And here's the outside of the building. Here's the inside of the building. You'll notice a worship team practicing there. So, get this, I just found this out on Sunday, but a CRC church plant, I mean it's not a church plant anymore, it's 20 years old, they have started worshiping in this old church. So that's a little bit of a hopeful story too. I mean, I know it's just a building, but still, a place of worship that people have been worshiping there for years and years and years and years and years. And now the worship continues through a CRC church plant. I think that's pretty neat. That's a picture. Someone posted it on Facebook. I was like, what? That's my grandma's church. So a hopeful story there. So at the end of the day, it really is the mainline denominations that are taking it in the chin. They used to have huge influence in Canada, huge influence, big churches, but that is waning and is nearly dried up. And here's a good statistic on where things are going there. Did you know that there are now more teenagers in Canada who identify as Muslim than there are teenagers who identify as Anglican, United, and Methodist put together? So that's where things are going there. So back to my 5% statistic. I'm not quite sure if that's 100% accurate. Maybe that's a church planner trying to build a little tension and make a good pitch to people who might want to help support his church plant. I don't know. That's kind of a negative way of looking at it. But my best guess is that that's a little low. It's probably closer to 10%. But it could be about the average side of the evangelical community in Canada, or in Victoria, about maybe 5% or so. So what do we do? Where do we go? Let's see. We'll just keep that one up there, the hopeful picture. What does this mean? And I'd say I'm still thinking this through. Like, I'm still mulling it over. It's not as though there is an easy solution or, do this and everything will change. This is a long-term trend and trajectory that I think needs to cause us to do some creative thinking, some praying, some wondering, and then some experimentation. But I'll just respond personally how this research has impacted me first. For me, I know that I need to continue to grow in my missionary identity. My calling as a minister of Christ is to continue to find ways to communicate the gospel in the context in which I've been called. So the question I'm asking myself now is, how does the gospel translate into a society where the individual is king? So the Heidelberg Catechism, as most of you know, begins with these comforting words. What is my only comfort in life and in death? Answer, that I am not my own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. These words were powerfully comforting in a Catholic context where people were worried about their salvation and their connection to Christ. But for modern Canadians, it's not necessarily a comfort to belong to God because they aren't interested in salvation. In fact, God gets in the way of them living the life they want to live. The gospel for modern Canadians is, I am my own. My life belongs to me. I get to decide how to live it. So how to translate? How to translate? I know how to describe what it means to be a Reformed Christian in relation to other Christians, but I need to continue to grow in my capacity to communicate clearly and whimsically with the current culture. So just that's what missionaries do, right? Cultural analysis. How does the story of the Bible make connections with this other place? And then secondly, something else I'm thinking, these are kind of random really, but just the things that I'm thinking about that are important. Encouragement. I know I need to grow in my capacity to continue being an encouraging person. And by encouragement, I don't simply mean letting people know that they're doing a good job or encouraging their personhood. I mean, that's good too. But by encouragement, I mean encouraging people in the faith. I mean, you may be the only Christian in your class, the only Christian in your place of work. You may be the only Christian left in your family. How can I, in my preaching, discipling, pastoral care, how can I grow in my capacity to speak a word that lifts a brother or sister up and encourages them in the faith? Like what Paul did with all these churches. They're like these small groups in these big pagan cities, encouraging them in the faith. I want to grow in my capacity to do that well. Thirdly, I think that this time of transition, I think this is not just for me, but for all of us. I think this time of transition is inviting us to grow deep as a church, as opposed to wide. It's a little bit of a time of sifting. You know, the wheat, it's a kind of a mean way of putting it, but the wheat and the chaff are blowing apart. I mean, if it's not a windy day, the wheat and everything just kind of falls back down. But now that the winds of change are blowing pretty strong, we're being sifted, and it's an opportunity to think about who we are and what we really believe. I think the seeker-sensitive movement is over. I mean, I'm talking with church planners, and they're realizing, it used to be the case you could just offer something a little bit better than the church down the street, and voila, you had yourself a church. It does not work like that anymore. Two scholars are studying this, David Haskell and Kevin Flatt from Ontario. They did a study of traits of growing and declining mainline churches in Ontario. And it was hard for them to actually find enough growing mainline churches to study, but they found a few. And their paper was called Theology Matters. You can read about it in the National Post. It was published a while ago. In the study, Haskell and Flatt discovered that there's a relationship between theological conservatism and church growth. So simply put, this is what they mean by theological conservatism. Clergy and congregations that actually believed in God, trusted the Bible, and prioritized the mission of God, those churches were growing. While those that tilted towards liberalism, so not really sure about who is God, not really sure about what the Bible is and how to engage this book, and not really excited about God's mission, well, they were the ones that were declining. So it's the churches that set the lowest bars that are declining the quickest, and this is the irony. So for decades, and the United Church of Canada is a little bit easy to pick on, and I shouldn't always do that. My grandma, after all, was a member her whole life, and it was a great place for her. But they don't want to offend, right? We do not want to have any bars that keep you from being a part of our community. So very low bar. But strangely, they're not growing. There's no one who wants to be a part of that. So in my opinion, the Christian community in Canada really, I think we're having a moment where we need to clarify and determine our relationship specifically with Jesus. Do we really believe that people need him? Do you really believe that you need him, that he is essential? And that he's not just, one great teacher among many. During this time of sifting, we are being forced to ask that question. Who is Christ? Do we really need him? Do I really need him? And do other people really need him? We are being forced to ask that question. And I personally think we need to grow deeper in our firm belief that we absolutely 100% need Christ, and other people need him too. Either we'll grow deeper, I think, or we'll get blown away. And I'm not just talking about theology here, but also worship. I think now more than ever we need to be rooted and have real food, not fast food, and encourage just this robust communion with the risen and ascended Lord, and through the Spirit. This is not the time for just laissez-faire worship. This needs to be rich and deep because people need it for their lives in the world. We are being challenged. We need good formation happening at church. And then finally, and this is something I'm thinking about, and I think we all need to think about this, because this might be one of the ways forward. I find myself thinking about friendship. I don't know why this is making me tearful, but it's like deep, meaningful connection. The culture is tilting away from the church. The culture is allergic to evangelism, but we are hungry for real connection. Real connection. I love my Christian friends. I'm very thankful for often what is real connection I have with them. But these days, I'm really valuing the people that God has put in my life that aren't Christians. And my goal right now is simply to be a good friend and to engage in deep, meaningful connection with them. My goal for going to the neighborhood place is not evangelism. I don't go there because I think, this is a great place to be a missionary. Maybe it's a small part, but that's not. I go there because I really like these people. I want to be with them. I want to hear about what's going on in their life. And I want to share what's going on in my life. So the goal in real friendship is not to change the other person, but to be in relationship with the other person and to do so in an authentic and vulnerable way. So that kind of friendship is a friendship where I'm allowed to bring my whole self out into relationship with you, and you are allowed to bring your whole self out in relationship with me, and we connect on a deeper level and talk about life and make sense of life together. And if I'm bringing my whole self out in relationship with you, that means I'm going to be honest and authentic about who Jesus is to me. Because if I hide that part of myself, then I'm no longer being honest and authentic, right? And so in that place of hopefully the relationship being, good, there's space for people to say what they actually truly think and believe. And I wonder, what if we took that kind of ministry seriously, the ministry of friendship? My hunch is that this kind of human-to-human connection is what we in the church need to get good at. Canadians hate being evangelized, but people are hungry for this kind of friendship. And here's where Charles Taylor can perhaps become helpful again. Because all of us, he says, experience the pressures of immanentization and transcendence. So I experience doubting my faith. That's just a part of what it means to be human today. You're always questioning, is this true? Is this how it worked? But they're also doing the exact same thing about their disbelief. They're like, am I right thinking this way? People are not content in their current space. We're being pressurized. So as we engage in meaningful connection, it opens up space for all kinds of rich conversation, because people are confused and they are, I think, desperate for honest conversation. Yeah. Anyway, I'll finish there. It's been an hour. I don't really have anything else to say other than show this. I like this face the best. And I think, it's not crazy. I think another piece is, it's not crazy to feel like the forest is a spiritual place, because it is a spiritual place. It has a creator, all things made through Christ. There is a face in the forest. It's the face of Christ. It's not crazy that people have these experiences. We can engage them in that. All right, that's what I learned. I'm curious your questions. Let's have maybe 15 minutes or so. Dialogue. I'll stay as long as you guys want to ask questions. Yes, Jake.
Dialogue
Yeah.
is what you're talking about with friendship.
Yes.
It's the hardest thing
Yeah.
for most people
Yeah.
because we're so preoccupied with where we're at
Yes.
and we're so easily threatened by others are at.
Totally.
So that's-
It's not easy.
It is very difficult.
Yeah.
Few people have it.
Yeah. It requires a patience.
It requires a lot more than that.
Yeah. And I think with friendship, I think you have to pay attention to who you're attracted to. And obviously that's not good if it's like,
No.
someone of the opposite sex, then you should probably have some boundaries. But for me, like with
Depends
the...
on your age.
Well, I don't know. I've heard stories, but
We'll see.
I want to, like, some of these people, I'm like, I like being with you.
Yes.
And maybe that is God's way of saying, you guys should be connected, be friends.
If you look at the story of Jesus, that's how he operated with everyone.
Dialogue.
Always started with the other person's end.
Lots of one-on-one connection too. Yeah. Yeah. Dialogue.
Anyway.
Bill.
Have my say.
Yeah, David, I appreciate how you brought us around. You started talking about trends in society. And I'm interested in that, like Bibi is and so on. But how you brought it back to, okay, what about the qualitative as opposed to the quantitative, right? Joel Thiessen versus Bibi.
Yeah.
And how, sometimes I'm more interested in the exceptions rather than the trends.
Yeah.
In other words, what made that the exception? What made that different? Why did evangelical churches kind of stay even when there was this landslide effect somewhere else? And probably
Yeah.
within the evangelical. Like, what about the exceptions?
Yeah.
That's what I'm interested in, those stories.
Yeah. The bright spots. I think this was a part of my sabbatical that I didn't get to. I wanted to interview 4 to 6 churches and pastors in thriving churches. So churches that had engaged in not just brand new churches, but churches that were like 40 years old or more, who had entered into a season of health and wholeness. And I wanted to hear their stories. One of the reasons I stopped, I didn't pursue that, is because Joel Thiessen's doing that. So I'm going to wait for him to make the book, and I'm going to read it. So he's part of this institute in Calgary called the Flourishing Congregation Institute, and so I'll wait for him to.
Yeah.
But that's good question.
Yeah, and you gave an example of that in church on Sunday when you talked about how Tim Keller started with his family at a church in New York.
Yeah.
Guess what? Hundreds of churches now.
Yeah.
It's an exception, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Why is that?
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Bill?
Yeah.
I have thoughts about friendship.
Yeah. Friendship. It's more than that with Keller, but you got something to add to this, Ken?
Building on that, as you were talking, what I was kind of picking up on is that there's this dichotomy in humans where we have reality, what we can perceive and sense, and the stuff that we can't perceive and what we can't sense, but we have a feeling that it's there.
Right.
God, spirit, spirituality, and then that's the realm of miracles, that's the realm of things happening that we can't perceive or believe as real. But we as Christians believe that both exist.
Mm-hmm.
Now the religions that focus too much on this, it's like, well, it's about the here and now. Let's not worry about spirituality or belief in God, or they sunk.
Yeah.
But the other ones also sunk. The ones that were like, it's all about heaven.
Yes.
Let's not worry about the world, let's just get to heaven.
Yes.
Those sunk as well.
Yeah.
So the ones that were more balanced and saying spirituality exists in the physical and in the metaphysical at the same time
Yeah.
as a spectrum, those are the ones that seem to be in sync with God's word and are sticking around. So I'm just speculation, but
Yeah. Well, certainly, and that's the depth of the Christian tradition, finding that right balance of spiritual life and the life in this world, creation care, having a holistic view of the world. Yeah. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I grew up in the United Church.
Mm-hmm.
And after I married and came into the Christian Reformed Church, we would go and visit my parents. And the United Church, I have to say up front, has a tremendous record when it comes to social justice issues that I didn't see in the Christian Reformed Church when I
Yeah.
first arrived.
Yeah.
But what happened to the United Church is it's such a big tent that there were, in my parents' church, there was a pastor who came in. He preached the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
He was very good at connecting with people.
Yeah.
I attended a service where he was welcoming, there was confession of faith, a whole row of people
Right.
handing out Bibles,
Yeah.
right? Fine. Then the next man came along. He was sort of a pretend Anglican.
Mm-hmm.
And the sermon that he preached the Sunday we were there was about peace. But the peace he was talking about was Owen Sound, Ontario becoming a nuclear-free zone.
Right.
And I turned to Peter and I said, the peace that passes understanding is reduced
Yes.
to this.
Yes.
And I asked my father very delicately, I said, the liturgy here seems to change.
Mm-hmm.
He said, Heather, it changes monthly. And this, there were people, they just kept coming, right? But they weren't being fed.
Right.
So this relates to when you said that churches who stuck to the gospel plus relationships,
Yes.
that works.
It does.
I
Yeah.
saw it happening.
Yeah. Right, and that still happens in plenty of United churches.
Yes.
Based on
yes,
the
yes.
based on the preacher.
Yeah, I've had other experiences with great preachers and congregations in the United Church, but it's so,
Yeah.
and there seems to be a lot more of the, well, we don't really want to get too deeply into
Yes.
the Bible, we
Yeah.
don't want to push that too much.
Yeah. That's right. That culture's there
And
too.
it doesn't work.
No.
I saw it.
Yeah. Yeah. Good observations. Thank you. Yeah, Bill.
When you look at classical evangelism, to me it seems we go out there and we tell people what they need.
Yeah.
We have something to offer, this is what you need.
Yeah.
If I listen a bit to Thiessen, from what your comments, I think he's more saying, what are your needs? And I think if we were to try to engage people on that basis,
Mm-hmm.
instead of being presumptuous,
Mm-hmm.
what in your life is lacking? And our society is very complex,
Mm-hmm.
our society is very busy. I think, and I see people saying, yeah, I'm religious, but quite frankly, they're up to their eyeballs in activities. A guy like this is, I know, he still manages to go to church, but I know other people, my children included,
Yeah.
they're as busy as this guy saying, I need a break on Sunday, I just don't need to go to
Yeah.
church, okay?
Yeah.
And so, if in our, in quotation marks, evangelism process, we think maybe about asking questions
Yes.
instead of being presumptive and
Yeah.
providing answers, maybe we can build some bridges.
Yeah, I think these are great points. And actually what you find, Bill, in many places too, is churches that are thriving are often they do a lot of experiments. And that takes a little bit of guts, because not all experiments work, and they cost money. But anyway, a lot of churches are like experimenting with a Saturday night service, because it's like this, and they're trying to accommodate people who cannot do the Sunday morning for sports or all these other reasons, too tired. And so I think you're absolutely correct in that, like, to be very attentive to what's going on and then try to meet that. But there's where the hunger is. Let's give this a try, experiment in that. Although I will still say that that's where having a conversation about Jesus, because I don't want to say that we have nothing to offer, and I think we do need to retain that we actually do have something that is very essential for other people to know. You can hoist that on them, and that's not the right way of going about it. But to say, no, actually there is a need here that we need to share. Yeah. Megan?
I think the hardest part about what we have to offer is that it has to start with the assumption of that I'm a sinful person. And as soon as I say that to someone who's got no religion or is done with religion, they're very concerned for me and my conception of self-worth.
Yeah.
Like, they think that I'm surrounded with guilt.
Right.
So it's hard to frame that in a positive way. Like, I have this idea of sin and this savior. I think that the concept of sin is just so lost in our culture that it's hard to get past that.
Totally.
Amen,
Yes.
sister.
Yeah. It's like, are you do we need to encourage you? We're
Yeah.
no, you're a pretty good person, Megan. We
Yeah.
really like being around you.
Exactly.
I think this is part of that gospel translation. Like, how do I take the Christian story, which has strong conceptions of sin and the need for a savior, into a culture that's pretty allergic to having we're always trying to build people up, and anything that kind of says you're a worthless sinner in need of grace is that is, of course you wouldn't say it like that, but that's amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, right? It's this is our story. So I don't know. You have any thoughts about what do you do when that happens?
The most helpful thing I've heard is my brother, who went to the Royal Military College. He said people would say to him "Oh, you're a Christian. You're such a good person," and his response was right away "No, I'm not. That's why I'm a Christian. I need help." And that would always just take people by surprise, because it's really easy for people want to accept that I am a good person.
Right.
So it opens a conversation if you can counter it.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, from what I'm hearing is that we're focusing a lot on the doctrine and theology, but I think first and foremost the church is social, and we have to meet the society where it's at, and so we have to, as a church community, change our focus to where the needs are. And Megan say, well, people don't feel that they're sinners, but why are antidepressants the number one prescribed drugs in Canada or the U.S.? And why is loneliness the new smoking?
Right.
Right, so there's two huge areas in society. There's a huge need, and if we as a church can't fill that need, we have no relevance.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so we first and foremost have to become relevant in the social landscape before people are going to start asking us, why did you actually reach out? Well, that's because we have an example in Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Well, I think this is the conversation, Greg. I would love to even just sit with 5 or 6 people and talk about this for about 2 hours. Do we witness best by becoming relevant? So this is the Bibby. This is the Bibby way, right? There's a hunger. Try to provide a supply that meets the demand, Or do we witness best by offering something alternative that is actually has more depth, and just say, actually, this is going to be strange for you to be part of this community. You're going to hear things that don't make sense to you, but we'll be with you and try to explain this. there's a fascinating thing happening in that there's a renewed hunger for the Eastern Orthodox Church. It takes like years before you are able to become a member of the Eastern. It's like, oh, you want to become a member? Here, like start this program that takes a long time, and then one day we'll see maybe if you become a member, right? Like there's this high bar. So there's a hunger for that then too. So those are kind of two extremes. Like the super easy front door, no problems coming in, you're welcome, come as you are, and then there's actually we set a high bar, and we're gonna disciple you towards that, right? So I would love to sit and talk about that for, maybe there's a balance, probably, hopefully. Yeah, Henry.
I like the way you ended it off, and some of those directions, and there's probably a few more considerations that we should look at. But one statistic you omitted, and it likely didn't come from those two gentlemen, is that a good 30% of that 18 to 35, they've moved away from the church, is because the church, as an organized religion, has boo-booed on so many serious things over the last 100 years, 50 years.
Yeah.
And a good example of that, you didn't touch on it in Quebec, I don't know if Tony's here, but
Yeah.
Duplessis,
Yeah.
when he left, you
Yeah.
know, and the church and the state were exactly,
That's right.
you know, one and the same.
Yeah.
They ruled your life in every way. So
That's
when
right.
that ended,
Yeah.
it was just like,
Yeah.
flush that church out just like that.
That's right. People were like, and we're done with this. Yeah. We don't
We're
need that
done with
anymore.
this.
Yeah.
It's like a yoke had lifted off the shoulders.
That's
What a
right.
terrible thing for us to say
Right.
as Christians.
Yeah.
But the church has been that way. I can remember in the 60s, our church, United Church maybe even, was still proud of what they did with the Native community. You know, and only now do we have the guts to go through a reconciliation process.
Yeah.
Well, maybe as a church, we've got a lot to reconcile for.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of things. So that 18 and 35, until they see that the
Yeah.
church will repent for a lot of their travails,
Yeah.
we are not going to bring them back in the door.
Yeah. You know, great point, Henry. And I'm thinking back, I did a similar talk at Labrie in July. And the crowd was actually a lot of people who were post-church, but still identified as Christian, but they were kind of Christian but done with the church.
Mhm.
And so they kind of challenged me on some of that too, and I didn't adjust to bring in some of their observations, but you brought up some of their concerns. And yeah, that's whether or not there will be a return. Should we find enough things that we agree to confess to? But certainly one of the things that did come out in my research is that people who go through traumatic church events, especially in their teens or like early 20s, like that leaves a mark. So if the church is arguing or fighting or doing something very poorly, and the tension is branching out and causing splits or dramatic division, that leaves a mark on teenagers, and they're like, we're done with that. We don't want anything to do with that. Yeah. So that's one piece that I did read that confirms at least part of what you were saying.
And even the Catholic Church still is not quite ready to accept
Some of what
how
they've
the
done.
priests have misused kids.
Yeah.
And so until they do that,
Yeah.
they're going to pay for it dearly in membership.
Yeah. Yeah. Good points, Janice.
We haven't really talked about the Holy Spirit and the power and His moving in our lives and in our relationships and our praying for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think
The Holy Spirit has to move.
he does.
And
Yeah.
if the Holy Spirit doesn't move, nothing's going to happen.
Hmm.
And in history, there's been movements of the Holy Spirit
That's right.
where cities have, people have come and repented.
Yeah.
Like we need to pray for that.
Yeah. I think prayer has to be part of the, if nothing else, through this confusion, and as Bibi put it, the forest has been devastated, right? It's kind of a very dramatic way of putting it. But if we don't stop and just say, before we try to do anything, let's just spend some time praying. That's probably the right place to start. And let God lead us into a courageous new chapter.
Because when I was a kid, I went to United Church, and then when I went to university, that was it. And then in my mid-30s, I went back to a church, a friend of the family, my sister had invited me.
Yeah.
And the Holy Spirit was moving in that church. That was mid-80s.
Yeah.
And that church was just
It was absolutely
thriving.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
And because when I went, I wasn't looking for God. I wasn't seeking.
Yeah.
I just thought, oh, I'll meet some nice people.
Right.
And
But you came into a
That's
spiritually alive
yeah,
community,
yeah.
and you're like, what is
and
going
then
on?
God was working on me,
Yeah.
and like the Holy
Yes.
Spirit has to draw you.
Yeah.
You can't make people feel that.
Yeah, and that's her prayer. And yeah, Phil, and then Chava.
There's still time, is there?
Yeah, well, we'll keep going, but I will want to wrap it up just for people who want to leave. But
Okay,
yeah.
I've just, a long time ago, I read a book on church history, but maybe you read it too. Great big volume, it's still on my bookshelf, Church History by Piper, and I just reread it very, very recently. And I found it very encouraging because the kind of thing we're talking about has happened many times before.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know, there'd be a revival and people were coming to the Lord in droves and so on. Then as Kuiper puts it, the modernists would take over, who would say, well, maybe this part of the scripture, maybe you can question that. But there would be revival again and then falling down again,
Yeah.
So this has happened, all
Yes.
these cycles, it's not brand new. But I think, one of the things that I learned from that book is that when there was true preaching of the word, not pick and choose, but this is God's holy word, and accept it for what it is. This is God speaking to you, it's his love letter, and those are the times when the church would revive. And I think that's the clue to the whole thing. All the things have been mentioned, friendship and so on, I think it's all very important. But I think good preaching is core to the whole thing.
Yeah. I agree, and certainly it's true of this. This is not a new story. This is part of the story of history, and there are moments, revivals, prayer and preaching are at the center. They are. Okay, last question, Chava, and then we'll wrap it up. And anyone who wants to ask me questions later, go for it.
Just wanted to thank you for this.
Oh, you're welcome.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
And by my experience, thriving church community is a working and viable model, social model, where we can show others this is working. This is how you get your life in order.
Yeah.
These are the things that you have to check, and the method for this changes from year to year, and from province to province, and from city to city. And if we find that with Christ, there are not really large theological questions on the table. There are really small and pragmatic ones that we have to answer. And I think you show a very good initiative for that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Chava. Well, thanks for coming out, everybody. I hope it was educational and enjoyable. And I'll stick around. If anyone wants to come talk, I'd happily do that.